Hello students, and welcome to our video series on writing with a formal tone. This is all about style. In our first video, we'll be focusing on two simple things that you can do to make your writing sound a bit more formal, and that's avoiding personal pronouns and avoiding contractions. Let's start with personal pronouns. Now, pronouns in general are any words that replace a person, place, or thing, that replace a noun. So for example, the word they could replace Marco and Juan. Instead of saying Marco and Juan all the time, I start saying they, so they is a pronoun. Instead of saying the university over and over again, I can say it, so it is a pronoun. And we've got quite a few pronouns in the English language, and some of those pronouns we would call personal pronouns. And those are the ones that we want to avoid in formal writing. There's nothing wrong with them in general. We just don't tend to use them in formal, more academic writing. One of the biggest culprits here is the pronoun I. So people are often tempted to say things in a paper like I think, I feel, I believe, in my opinion. It's very me, and it makes it sound personal. It makes it sound informal. So you want to avoid any version of I. Now, of course, there are many more personal pronouns than just I, so let's go over all of them. The first category is what we would call the first person pronouns, and you may have heard, don't write using the first person. Well, that's what this refers to. So these pronouns are I, me, my, mine, myself, so anything having to do with you. And then the plural versions of that, we, us, our, ourselves. So in that case, we, us, etc., you're including yourself in that group. So those are still first person pronouns. Now let's talk about the second person pronouns. These are also personal pronouns. And they don't include you, but they are basically the entire you category. These include you, your, yours, yourself. And these pronouns, when you use them in writing, make it sound like you're having an informal chat with your reader. So you don't want that. You want it to sound more formal. And oftentimes when you use you, what you're actually doing is referring to people in general. For instance, think of a sentence like this. When you go to the beach and don't wear sunscreen, you tend to get sunburned. Who is this you? You're really talking about people, right? So you could just say when people go to the beach and don't wear sunscreen, they tend to get sunburned. Or when tourists go to the beach and don't wear sunscreen, they tend to get sunburned. If you could get any more specific than people, certainly do, but sometimes you really do mean all people. But actually say what group you're talking about rather than using that general informal you. So then which pronouns are acceptable? The third person pronouns, because these are impersonal. So these include he, him, his, himself, she, her, hers, herself. Also for things, you can say it, its, itself. And then in the plural, you can say they, them, their, theirs, themselves. These are impersonal pronouns and they are preferable in academic writing. So you might be tempted, for instance, to say something like, we Americans, if you happen to be American. But even though you fall into that category, what if somebody from another country is reading your paper? It would be odd to them to hear we Americans, right? So even though you happen to maybe be an American, you would still just say Americans in the paper or they. So the easiest thing to do here is just to go through your paper when you finished writing it and do a search for any of those personal pronouns, and any ones that you spot, find a way to say that sentence without having to use the personal pronoun. Okay, switching gears a little bit, now let's talk contractions, which you also want to avoid. For those of you who may not remember the term, a contraction is basically just when you contract two words together to form a short version of the two words, and you use an apostrophe. So for example, won't instead of will not, shouldn't instead of should not, don't instead of do not. A lot of them have not in it, but not all of them do. So for instance, she'd instead of she had or she would, it's instead of it is, or that's instead of that is, right? So these are all contractions whenever you join two words, make it a shorter version with an apostrophe. That's something to avoid in formal writing. Just like with personal pronouns, nothing wrong with contractions in general. It's just something that we tend to avoid for more academic writing. Usually we want to write out the full two words. Just a quick note on exceptions here. If you are quoting something word for word and the quote from your source uses a personal pronoun or uses a contraction, then it's a word for word quote. You shouldn't change it. So you would keep the personal pronoun or contraction in there. And sometimes that might be appropriate. Like let's say that you are quoting a sentence from an interview and the person being interviewed says I. Well, that would make sense, right? So if you're quoting, you can make an exception. But other than that, throughout your paper, you want to scan and make sure that you're avoiding both personal pronouns and contractions. So that's a pretty easy fix to make your writing sound a little bit more formal.